Thank you for joining us this afternoon. It's my great pleasure to announce Ambassador Linton Brooks, who is the head of the National Nuclear Security Administration and the lead negotiator on the First START Treaty. And now I have the pleasure of working with him through the Public Policy and Nuclear Threats Boot Camp. I also want to mention that this webinar is co-sponsored by the Nuclear Science and Security Consortium, which is a multi-institution initiative on campus training the next generation of nuclear security experts, and the Nuclear Policy Working Group. Linton.
Thanks. So I'm going to talk to you about Trump administration nuclear posture review. And Bethany asked me to say a couple of words about why anybody would want to listen to me on this subject. So let me give you the Reader's Digest version of the perspectives I bring to this. I spent my first 20 years after college in, my first 30 years after college in the Navy, but I spent the first 20 of those on ships. I was on 6 ships, all of which were capable of carrying nuclear weapons, 4 of which actually did, including the ship I commanded. I came to Washington around 1979 after my last command, and spent the next 10 years in a series of jobs with the word policy, strategy, or nuclear, just in different orders. Most of them in the Navy, some of them in the Office of Secretary of Defense, and ultimately I found myself at the White House on the National Security Council staff in the Reagan era. In the George H.W. Bush era, I was first the deputy negotiator and then the chief negotiator of the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty signed in 1991. And subsequently was briefly, as it turned out, when the president didn't get re-elected, at the Arms Control Disarmament Agency. I also negotiated the second Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, a very good treaty negotiated in the post-Cold War euphoria, which never got ratified because the post-Cold War euphoria didn't last very long. In the George W. Bush administration, I came back first running the non-proliferation program, and secondly running the entire National Nuclear Security Administration, where I was responsible for the U.S. weapons program. And in the last several years since I left government, I've been deeply involved in 2 things. One is the national labs, particularly the 3 weapons labs, including Lawrence Livermore and Lawrence and Los Alamos, which are UC related, and working on the next generation. So I come at this entirely from the perspective of a practitioner. You will not get academic theories. I come at this from the perspective of a practitioner who's seen a fair amount. So this is intended to be an objective presentation, not a either defense or attack, but keep in mind that as you think about it. Now, nuclear posture reviews, by definition, are a mixture of continuity and change. Continuity, because first of all, there actually is a broad consensus on the fundamentals at the highest level of U.S. nuclear policy. And continuity because forces take an enormously long time to change. So it doesn't matter if you want to change things, you can't. Essentially, they take far longer to change than any single administration. Change, however, also shows up because first, the world changes, the international environment changes. And secondly, because administrations come with different philosophy. So the first thing to understand about the Trump document, which we call it the Trump NPR, the president personally had very little to do with this document. That has been true for most nuclear policy reviews, nuclear posture reviews. The Obama presidency was an exception. We'll get to that in a little bit. But the new administration's NPR reflects their quite dark view of international relations. This administration sees the world as having gotten much more dangerous in the last 10 years. This administration sees that danger primarily in terms of conflict between what we might call great powers, or nuclear powers at least. And therefore, this administration thinks that it is that area that it needs to focus on, rather than, for example, Afghanistan, Iraq, those kinds of conflicts. Although this administration is not finding it any easier to end its involvement in Afghanistan than the last administration did. So before we go to the current document, let's talk about how we got there. The Cold War, there were no nuclear posture reviews. Documents just didn't exist because we didn't have them. Administrations of both parties believed, heck, knew that nuclear weapons were needed to prevent Soviet domination of the world and Soviet destruction of the United States. Now, there was a lot of fighting during the Cold War about how you carry that, what forces were good, what forces were dangerous. But on that basic reason for nuclear weapons, within the government, I don't mean to denigrate the people who marched to ban the bomb throughout the Cold War, but they shared the common characteristic that they weren't in government, had never been in government, and had no chance of being in government. So we didn't have to think about why we had nuclear weapons. China was a round-off error. It was an afterthought. It was a lesser-included case. And nuclear terrorism really, except in a very small specialist community, was a limited concern. And then the Cold War ended. And we had to think about, what do nuclear weapons matter from now? Well, why do we have them? So there have been 4 formal reviews: the Clinton, George W. Bush, Obama, and Trump administration. And there was an important informal review, never published, by the George H.W. Bush administration. George H.W. Bush administration actually did a deep review that resulted in the largest quantitative reduction in our stockpile in history, essentially took us out of the business of tactical and theater nuclear weapons, meant that the 6,000 warhead treaty that I negotiated in 1991 and I thought was proud, was about as low as we could go, could be replaced 2 years later by 3,500 warheads because of a very careful recalibration of what our needs. So there was a very thorough review. We just don't talk about it because they never wrote it down. Now, each of those reviews was based on the specific administration's view of the world and on the reality that while policy can change quickly, as I said, forces take a long time. To illustrate that, every weapon in the stockpile today and every delivery system in the stockpile today was designed in the Cold War. And with the exception of a handful of warheads for one system and a handful of missiles for that same system, everything that is in the arsenal today was built in the Cold War, which those of you closer to my age will remember was some time back. So we had these 4 reviews. Reader's Digest version. Clinton. We're going to lead the Russians toward reductions because it's a bold new era, but we're going to hedge because this has been an authoritarian state for 3 centuries and it might go back to that way. And we're going to try and do this in a way that we can deliver a peace dividend. Clinton NPR. George W. Bush NPR. Russia is not a day-to-day threat. Therefore, we don't need to focus on that in constructing our force posture. We're going to focus on defenses, infrastructure, and conventional substitution for nuclear weapons. I know that's not the common view of the George W. Bush administration, but that's because when 9/11 happened, essentially they stopped thinking at the highest levels about nuclear weapons, never published the results of their quite thoughtful nuclear posture review, and became entirely captivated with the subject. Obama. President Obama was much more involved in the details than most presidents. And his review emphasized countering nuclear terrorism and preventing nuclear proliferation as the most urgent, not the most important. He didn't make that claim. The most urgent problem. And he sought to maintain strong nuclear forces while trying to create the conditions for long-term reductions and ultimately for abolition. Now, I said there was continuity. One thing that was continuity among the people who conducted the review, and I'm not trying to claim knowledge and attitudes within the entire body politic. We all believed, I was involved in a couple of these, that nuclear deterrence saves lives. It saves lives by preventing war between major powers, because in the time we're going to spend today, the United States and the Russian Federation could each end the other as functioning societies. They don't, and it would be fanciful to think that anybody would consider it, because we both have forces that can devastate the other no matter who goes first. And that condition, often called mutual assured destruction, means that deliberate nuclear war is simply irrational. And because nobody knows what happens once you start fighting, and escalation dynamics are not well understood while they're happening, conventional war between nuclear armed states is also irrational. It's too risky to contemplate. Now, that belief has been around for a long time. The Trump administration decided to make it explicit by including a variant of this slide. This is a slide that most of you will have seen somewhere on the internet. It is almost identical to the one in the document. The version I had has Michael Quinlan's quote. Since I happen to be a huge fan of the late Sir Michael, I left it on there, so you can't blame that on me. What this is supposed to tell you is, since the beginning of the modern state system, Treaty of Westphalia, this is the percentage of the population that has died in wars on a year-by-year basis. And you see a couple things. You see the long-term gradual decrease in violence, which has been documented in some of the academic literature. You see the spikes for the major wars of the 20th century. And then you see a great big drop around 1945. Now, I'm in an academic institution. I need you to understand, I actually do know that correlation and causation are different terms. I understand that. I also know that there are thoughtful scholars who argue that the so-called long peace in Europe has nothing to do with nuclear weapons, and have well-argued reasons why that's so. I'm simply saying that practitioners, while we can't prove a negative, we can't prove that there wouldn't have been war in Europe if nuclear weapons didn't exist. We think it's likely that nuclear weapons played an important role. I lived in Germany in 1946, and I will tell you that the aftermath of large-scale industrial age warfare is not something that you would aspire to. Full disclosure here, lots of people have died since 1945 in internal conflicts. Nuclear weapons do nothing to solve internal conflicts with very minor and not very interesting inspections. So I said that each NPR reflects the administration's worldview. National security strategy, national defense strategy, nuclear posture review, remarkably consistent documents. Focuses, as I said earlier, on great power confrontation. Nuclear posture review also continues the long-standing practice of tailoring deterrence. What will deter one state may or may not deter another state. We used to think in the Cold War that deterrence would always operate with everybody, but that's not true. States value different things, so you have to hold different things at risk. They want to do different things that you don't want them to do. So, for example, Mr. Kim wishes to ensure two things. He wishes to ensure the survival of his family, and he wishes to ensure that they continue to be in charge in Korea. And he's the only one who matters. So one thing you have to convince Mr. Kim of is that if there is nuclear war, his regime will not survive. On the other hand, we're not going to go try to change the regime of Vladimir Putin. Mr. Putin has to be convinced that if he gets adventurous with a NATO ally, as he did with Ukraine, the consequences of that will be bad, and that he will not be able to escalate his way out of that strategy. So we have to tailor deterrence, and that's a fairly common practice, but it's important to understand this administration continues that notion. Tailoring deterrence is hard once you get beyond the bumper stickers, because you have to really study the society that you're looking. So I said to you earlier that we were looking at what is the fundamental purpose of nuclear weapons. And these are the four that this administration has derived. Now, the first two are completely consistent with past U.S. policy. Everybody says deterrence of nuclear and non-nuclear attack. And by the way, despite some of the concerns raised by some of the president's early remarks about a year ago about allies, pay more, the NPR has the traditional stress on deterrence of attacks to our allies. It is no different in that regard from any of its predecessors. And by the way, you should understand that the United States is actually unique in the degree to which it structures its nuclear forces to defend allies. No other state in history. The Soviet Union had some satellites that it would defend or not defend, depending on how it was consistent. The United States has had a long policy that our nuclear forces are to defend our allies as well as ourselves. And that leads to the second thing, which is assurance. If you are going to have that policy, you got to work really hard to make sure your allies believe it. Because in essence, we used to say in the Cold War, would the United States trade New York for Berlin? And the answer we gave was yes, and I think it was a real answer, although fortunately we never had to find out. Now, this assuring of allies has been historically important because it has led us to a belief that our nuclear forces had to be second to none. None of the reviews I've mentioned use the word second to none. All of the administrations I've mentioned maintained forces in a way that were second to none. And by second to none, this is not a quantitative thing. It is that there not be the perception that our strategic forces are significantly inferior to the strategic forces of any other country, not because it matters. The truth is, if Russia had twice as many nuclear weapons as we did, and ours were still survivable, deterrence will work just fine, but because of the concern on our allies. And some of my friends in the abolition community have trouble with that because they have trouble with believing in extended nuclear deterrence. But this administration clearly does believe in an extended deterrence. Now, the third one, if deterrence fails, has always been there, but this is the first time it's been articulated. What they say is, if deterrence fails, well, first, the plans that back up our deterrent are war plans, unambiguous war plans. They're called war plans. They're done the same way other war plans are. They have military objectives. They assign forces. They want to achieve and accomplish. And the NPR says, if deterrence fails, the United States will strive to end any conflict at the lowest level of damage possible and on the best achievable terms for the United States, its allies and partners. Now, first, that's not new. What's new is saying it in part of a document. That's actually gotten, I mean, people have been so grumpy about the rest of the document, nobody's focused on this one. This is actually something that can be misinterpreted to sound like you're endorsing nuclear war fighting. It's not. It doesn't suggest winning a nuclear war is possible. Ronald Reagan, when he said a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, really has been speaking for all of his successors and for everybody I know who matters within. There's nobody I have met remotely near the center of decision making who thinks that the deliberate use of nuclear weapons is a good idea. The final objective has also never been expressed, and that's hedging against an uncertain future. I happen to think this is an excellent innovation. If you look back to when we walked through the 4 past things, you can see that each of them assumed a future that didn't last very long. To give a personal example, I negotiated one of the most impressive arms control treaties in history. I was really proud of it. 5 months after that treaty got negotiated and signed, the country I negotiated with went away, and I never saw it coming. Okay, so hedging against an uncertain future because experts can't predict it seems to me a pretty good principle. What they don't do is tell you a whole lot about how they're going to do that. The one thing they specifically say is that while the last administration wanted to reduce the non-deployed stockpile of spares, this administration has ended that policy very quietly, but that's the one thing they do that they explicitly tie to this. But implicitly, this ties to the emphasis on building a strong infrastructure and on revitalizing and maintaining science at the national labs. Now, when you look at the NPR, you know, looks like a lot of government reports, bound, pretty cover, neat pages, and you think that's a government report. In Washington, it's not a government report. It's a Rorschach test. If you believe that the current administration is dangerously militaristic, if you believe that it is reckless, then the changes in the NPR you think are very important. They're very bad. If you believe that the last administration was dangerously naive, then you think that the changes in the NPR are very important They're very good. If you're me and you don't believe either of those things, you think the changes are just sort of modest, and yeah, we ought to argue about them. But what's really important is the vast degree of continuity in the NPR. Now, keep those three views in mind as you look at commentary on this document. And there may be people who think this is a dangerous administration who love the NPR, and there may be people who thought that Obama was naive, who hate the NPR, but there aren't very many of them. Of course, this is a different document because it's a different world. If the team that wrote the 2010 NPR had been assigned to prepare this NPR, they would not have written the Trump document. But they wouldn't have written the 2010 document either. Let's talk about some of the changes. One thing that didn't change, the United States has maintained a so-called Triad: ICBMs, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and bombers. We've done that for 60 years. Yeah, that's right. Now, the Triad grew out of service rivalry. The Eisenhower era, nuclear was where the money was. Suddenly, everybody thought nuclear was just the ideal fit for their service. But it turns out that over time, we convinced ourselves that Triad actually did have some advantages because it complicated a surprise attack just impossibly. Now, after the Cold War, when nobody believes that Putin's going to wake up someday and say, gee, let's do a surprise nuclear attack on the United States, some people believe those advantages are no longer relevant. Most of the people who think that way want to abolish ICBMs. One of the people who used to think that way was the Secretary of Defense. So there was great interest in whether or not the Triad would endure. And the NPR basically completely rejects the idea that the Triad should be altered. These are the forces today with the implementation of New START. We have 400 Minuteman III silos scattered across states in the north. We have 50 empty silos. We have 50 empty silos because Congress in its infinite wisdom told us to have 50 empty silos rather than because it wanted to hedge against uncertainty. May turn out they were just ahead of the curve. We have 14 submarines. They were built with 24 tubes. They've been modified to only have 20 operational tubes. They carry the Trident II missile. Only 12 of them have missiles. The other two are in overhaul, carry no missiles, and have no military value. And then we have two kinds of bombers. You have a handout, and it says program of record. Program of record is a Washington term that means essentially what the Defense Department has in its long-range projection it submits with the budget and what we sort of think the Congress has agreed to. We use the term all the time as the agreed program, sort of the budget and procurement plans. Now you have a handout that shows in detail how they will change. This shortens it for those of you who... The Obama plan was to take the current ships, which are reaching the end of their operational life, and replace them with 12 Columbia-class submarines, which will carry initially the same missile. The Obama plan was to replace all Minuteman III missiles with a new missile that would be in refurbished silos. The Obama plan was to build an aircraft called the B-21, which mostly was going to get built because the Air Force needed it for conventional, but which was going to have a nuclear role because it was going to be survivable against air defense. And then finally, since the B-52s are going to be around apparently until your children are dead, the Obama plan said the air-launched cruise missiles they carry cannot penetrate Russian air defenses probably by the end of next decade. So we're going to replace it with a new weapon, which was called the long-range standoff weapon. And there was a rough, I mean, by the standards of American politics today, there was an amazing consensus on this program with the Congress. Now, the Trump administration did not want to shatter that consensus. They knew that if they tried to do something very radical, that they could break that consensus and not get funding for anything. So ideas that you have heard by some conservatives, or let's resume nuclear testing, or let's develop new warheads, or let's break out of START and start building up, or let's have some fundamental new designs, do fundamental new things. Those never got any traction, but there were some changes. First thing was it kept everything. There is no plan that the Obama administration had that is not part of the Trump administration plan. In addition, they wanted to do 4 things, 2 of which are easy, so we'll start with them. There's a very large bomb, largest bomb in the inventory, called the B-83. We were going to retire it in the last administration, probably in the next couple of years. B-83 is suited for hardened and deeply buried targets. That is where all national command authorities might be, in a place like, oh, say, Korea. And so we are keeping the B-83 clearly related to a Korean contingency. That's not, I mean, actually using nuclear weapons in Korea is immensely making sure that Mr. Kim knows that he can't hide by digging deeper. That's not very contentious. Secondly, for pure budget reasons, the refurbishment of the warhead for the new ICBM was slipped a year farther than most of my friends at Livermore would have liked. And so the new administration is going to start the funding for that earlier. Once again, not contentious. 2 things that are contentious. One is developing a new sea-launched cruise missile, which are very ambiguous about when this would happen. Start the study now. Probably it happens after all the big buildup. As your handout suggests, the funding for a lot of these things is in the 20s. When people say, we'll talk about cost, when people say we can't afford this, they really mean we bunched up the funding into the 20s, where it's going to be very hard. This will probably happen after that. Administration officials insist it's not intended as a bargaining chip. It certainly sounds like one. And the administration lost a certain amount of clout in that when the Secretary of Defense said it's a bargaining chip. And the purpose is the Russians are violating the INF Treaty, a Cold War treaty that bans ground-launched missiles of a certain range. The reasons for it are no longer valid. They were real, mostly, but they're no longer valid. But it's still a treaty, and they're violating. So this would be a counter to that wouldn't violate the treaty. That's the idea. It's certainly better than what the Congress was trying to pass, of compelling us to develop a ground-launched missile that would violate the treaty and would cause a firestorm. You've seen a lot of flurry about this. But the truth is, nothing's going to happen for the next year except some study money. Now, the study is fixed, in my view. It's going to be submarine only on the Virginia class, using the warhead designed for the long-range standoff weapon, using a lot of technology designed for the long-range standoff weapon. And if that's true, it's not a particularly hard technical challenge, but it's also, we'll be fighting about other things by the time we actually spend very much money on it. The one that has gotten a lot of attention is to replace some of the warheads on the Trident II D5 missile. Trident II D5 missile can carry 2 warheads, one smaller. These are nuclear words, so smaller still is unimaginable power. But to take the smaller one and reduce its yield significantly. The administration has sort of said they do that by simply making it only the primary. Most nuclear weapons have 2 stages. They just take the secondary off and replace it with nothing. Now, why would you want to do that? So here's what the administration says. It looks at a bunch of quotes. This is from the Secretary of the Russian Security Council in 2012. Procedure for use of nuclear weapons is in Russian military doctrine, provides for the possibility of their use when repelling aggression using conventional weapons, not only in large-scale war, but in other types of war. So if I started messing around with Estonia and NATO came in, that would be conventional, wouldn't be large-scale. That's interesting. Particularly interesting because the military doctrine that he cites doesn't actually say that. Suggests there may be a military doctrine that they don't make public. 2010, government release about one of their major exercises. To suppress a large center of resistance and to achieve minimal losses, a low-yield nuclear attack was mounted against the enemy. Vladimir Putin, 2017. By the way, he got reelected, for those of you who were wondering. In the circumstances of an escalating military conflict, demonstrating the readiness and resolve to employ force, including the use of non-strategic nuclear weapons, is an effective deterrence. So the administration looks at these quotes and a bunch of other quotes, and I suspect, but don't know, at some non-public, which is a euphemism for intelligence, information, and it concludes that if a crisis got out of hand, not that the Russians are planning it, I don't think the Russians are dumb enough to plan this, but blundering into conflict is not unheard of in human history. Russia might consider using a tactical weapon, and what would you want your president to do? Well, people will tell you, we have weapons with low yields. They're bombs and they're cruise missiles, and that's true. But Russians have been throwing a huge amount of money into their air defenses. And we're replacing the cruise missiles precisely because we don't think they can get through air defenses. And the bombs are on legacy aircraft till we get the F-35 deployed. And so right now and for the next decade, maybe you're not so sure, or much more to the point, maybe the Russians think that we don't have a response. So the argument is, let's have a response they can't possibly doubt that we can do. Most reliable ballistic missile in strategic forces history is the D5. Easy and cheap. Nuclear words now, I mean, I'm not going to crowdsource this one, but we could do this in a couple of years, relatively easily. Let's take a small number and make it clear that the Russians can't escalate their way out of a failed strategy without taking a risk they don't want to take. And so the administration has argued, that this doesn't lower the American nuclear threshold. this raises the Russian nuclear threat. Now, that's a complicated theory, but it's not a particularly hard modification. It's not a particularly expensive modification in the context of all the money we're going to spend. Question is how risky it is. Maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A. Finally, the NPR talks about modernizing nuclear command and control. Nobody ever pays attention to that. It's really important. Doesn't matter what the weapons can do if you can't talk to them, and if you don't know whether an attack is coming. So it's a very, very good thing, but we're not going to talk about it because it's not particularly so. Deterrence is a really weird concept because it exists in people's minds and it doesn't exist in your mind. It doesn't matter what you think about deterrence. Like John Steinbrenner, a wonderful man, used to say, I would be deterred by the threat of 5 nuclear weapons anywhere in this country. And I believe that. But it has nothing to do with what will deter the Soviets, the Russians, the Chinese. So deterrence is inherently very hard. You can, however, make it harder by being squishy about what you're really going to do. So what you say in this area matters a lot more than what you say in many areas. So what do they say? You have another handout on this which has essentially the same words up here but with some additional Obama information. They helpfully put a big box called declaratory policy so that we will know. And they have 3 things. This is the first one and it's the easiest. Look at the top. Nuclear weapons, extreme circumstances, vital interests. That is either verbatim or so close it doesn't matter, the Obama administration policy. What's different is the 2 things that come after. The Obama administration did not define what they meant by extreme circumstances. This administration tries to by saying significant non-nuclear attacks, which everybody sort of knew, and then what they mean by that. There was no Obama counterpart. My personal view is these things raise more questions than they answer, and I kind of wish they'd left them out. I don't think that it's anything particularly bad, but I wish they left it out. Now, a second change is very important. You may decide whether it's really good or really bad. The Obama administration made it clear that this was a temporary policy, that it wanted to work toward a world in which the only reason we had nuclear weapons was to deter nuclear attack, and there were no extreme circumstances. The sole purpose was to have a world in which nuclear weapons were only relevant to nuclear attack. Now, you can think for a moment, our allies want to have the warm, comfy feeling that if North Korea invades South Korea or Russians invade the Baltics, that all of our power will come to play. So you have to work on that. But that was the Obama administration goal. That goal is completely gone in the Trump administration. Second thing Trump administration said is this. This is what's called the negative security assurance. It's been around since the 70s. Wording gets tweaked periodically. But it basically says, if you're not a nuclear state, we're not going to threaten you with nuclear weapons, no matter how mad you are. This is identical with the Obama administration. And you can say, oh, look, continuity. Well, wait till we get to the next slide. But now, how important is this? If you read that very carefully, it'll be very hard to think of a country that any sane person would want to threaten with nuclear use where this doesn't allow it. So, but it's been considered important politically for the non-nuclear weapon states to have that assurance from the nuclear weapon states that they're not targets. But there's a caveat. The Obama administration had a caveat that said someday biological weapons might be able to kill 10 million people in the United States. If that day ever comes, we would not regard our negative security assurance as preventing nuclear retaliation. So if a non-nuclear weapon state achieved the ability to kill tens of millions of people with biological weapons, and that's not science fiction. I mean, I can tell you the agents that could be weaponized if you could do it. Trump administration generalized it. Generalized it to this. What it didn't do is tell us what it means. The obvious possibility is that it means being able to destroy the electric grid through cyber in a way that causes tens of millions of people to starve. You look at the High Frontier website with my colleague from the 80s, Hank Cooper. He's been beating this drum largely to nobody's attention for a long time. But the administration has said, well, it's not about today's cyber. Hasn't said what it's about. So the net result is it's not clear why they're putting this in. It's also not clear that it matters, because truth is, if 30 million people die and we know who did it, what we write in the nuclear posture review is not necessarily going to, I mean, the president is not going to say, the only way I can get back at those guys is nuclear, but we promised in the NPR we wouldn't do that. So I guess we'll just have to take it. That's not the way presidents think. Now, finally, the nuclear posture review says much less about nuclear terrorism, non-proliferation, and arms control. What it says about nuclear terrorism is sensible. Seems to me they're largely keeping the same policy. On non-proliferation, it's okay. I mean, if you like the last one, you'll like this. Most of what they're doing. The one exception is that the administration under President Obama was very concerned with providing rationale while we were meeting our obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Article 6 of that treaty has words about moving forward with disarmament. This administration doesn't give you any help in telling you, in this document, telling you how we're going to deal with that argument. But that's the only thing I think that is non-proliferation. Now, administration document is silent on the Joint Comprehensive Program of Action with Iran. If in fact this administration chooses to walk away from that, that will have fairly significant non-proliferation things, but the document doesn't say that. The document is, as most Republican documents are, very skeptical about arms control. That's sort of unfortunate, but since I happen to believe arms control between the United States and Russian Federation is about to collapse, and there's nothing meaningful we can do about it, may not matter what the administration said, except in terms of tone. Now this leaves caution. This slide comes out of the NPR, looks at the modernization, and it's supposed to convince you of some things. So you look out here, these are years across the thing, and you say, this big chunk is what we will spend on the new, the recapitalization, the modernization. Right through here is what we're going to spend no matter, just to keep the forces we've got. And the administration says, look, this is really an additional 3.7%. adds up to a total of about 6.4%. Let's look at the last two times we did this. First time we did this was in the Kennedy administration. We basically created the Triad. We deployed the 41 for Freedom, that's ballistic missile submarines. We deployed the first ICBMs. We began the process of significant bomber deployment. We spent 17% of the defense budget. And then, starting in the Carter administration, but essentially funded in the Reagan administration, we renewed it. We changed the old ballistic missile submarines for the current Ohio class. We modernized the ICBMs. We built the stealth bomber. We built the new cruise missiles. We spent about 10%. So what this is supposed to convince you is, by historical standards, this is a once every couple decades event, and the cost is reasonable. Secretary Mattis has said, not in the NPR, America can afford survival. Now that's true, but the question is opportunity cost, because if you spend this money on this, you won't spend it on something else. And I don't mean, look how many schools you could build for it. That's a separate argument. You won't spend it on something else that's related to defense. The most obvious example is the 355 ship Navy. Now, if you would decide you really wanted to do that, you'd like to spend a lot of money on that, precisely at the time when we're going to spend a lot of money on building the Columbia class. So the real question is not, and it shouldn't be portrayed as, can we afford it? It's, is this sufficient priority? Is this greater priority than the things we're not going to do because of this? This debate will continue because it doesn't matter what they say here, because every year we have something that looks like an appropriation process, although less and less lately. And we're going to be fighting this out every time. And with that, why don't we talk about what you want to talk about? Questions, comments, thoughts? Sir.
We see a rather aggressive development by Russia of new nuclear weapons. Putin came out.
Yeah, the speech.
Great systems. How do we respond to that?
I respond with the following. First of all, I don't know how. I think we, if by we mean, sorry guys, those of you who are closer to my age, the stuff they tell you about trying not to fall, that turns out to be true. There's a little less there than meets the eye, but there are a couple of things that worry me. First of all, this nuclear-armed cruise missile, it's not exactly clear that it's quite as near to operation as he said, but so what? I mean, it's nuclear, it's a cruise missile. Cruise missiles are a problem. They can deliver nuclear weapons. He can deliver nuclear weapons with the cruise missiles he's got. In the old days, we would have called it a competitive strategy. We tricked him into wasting a lot of money that didn't actually improve anything. It's very hard for me to get excited about this. Yes, it's got this infinite range, but you got to understand, they tend to really think that we're somehow going to have a national missile defense that is going to prevent them from attacking the United States. That's just not true. I don't care what the missile defense review says when it comes out. It's not true because we can't afford it. We don't know how to do it. So I'm not very excited about that one. The nuclear torpedo, and those of you who mercilessly fear this is a torpedo that will go underwater, cross at very high speed, thus using enormous energy, thus powered by some kind of nuclear reactor, and blow up in New York Harbor, and will be seeded with cobalt right out of a 1950s book called The Hell Bomb. And will not only destroy things, but make it so nobody can live there for decades. If you want to be serious about this event, one of the things you need to study carefully is the movie Dr. Strangelove. And this is the doomsday machine. It's wacky. I already told you they could destroy us as a functioning society. They don't need this. I don't know why they're doing it. I think it's a vestige of a program called Dead Hand. Now, the other thing, however, he talks about his new liquid heavy, which can carry lots and lots of warheads. That's got some operational meaning because if I'm right that arms control is going to collapse, historically, the Russians have taken their reductions by eliminating missiles to save money, but keeping each missile fully loaded. We've taken our reductions by eliminating warheads. So we've had, in a crisis, a greater ability to upload. This will reverse that. So one hedge against an uncertain future is, what do we do? I mean, suppose he decides that because of the aggressive United States, he's going to start deploying Sarmat with its full complement, which I don't know. You hear a lot of words. They haven't built the missile yet, so who knows? But suppose it can carry 40 warheads. And they're going to do that, and then they'll have lots more warheads than us. Now, remember, I told you that doesn't matter as long as we have survivable warheads, but it will suggest to our NATO allies that we no longer can be trusted on as a guarantor of their independence, and could lead them to be more accommodationist. I don't know. I think it's those kinds of things. I don't think it makes the world, the destruction. If you don't like the fact that Putin can destroy the United States today, I'm sorry, but problems with no solutions aren't problems. They're just facts, and that's a fact. In terms of what we do to counter it, I think it will depend on what they actually do. I think we do need to be prepared to preserve second to none, because I think it's important to our allies. On the other hand, I don't want to insult the head of a sovereign state, but the mere fact that Vladimir Putin says something doesn't necessarily mean it's true. So I don't know. I'm not as excited about that. What's most worrisome about it is it continues the tendency he's had to nuclear saber rattle. And I think that's very dangerous because it heightens tensions, and we don't need anything to heighten tensions. Sir?
I've always been confused by the relationship between NATO and the U.S.
Excuse me for a second. I will stay as long as anybody wants. I understand you all have real lives and that this session has officially ended. I love this stuff. And so I will stay as long as you want. Go ahead, sir.
I've always been confused by the relationship between the U.S. and NATO on how someone decides to use a nuclear weapon. I've heard to some extent NATO has some authority in that. There's an authority to go ahead, authority to do not go ahead. I just don't understand it.
And NATO has made this clear in its doctrine. The decision to use nuclear weapons is a decision of the head of government of the nuclear possessing power. That is the President of the United States, Prime Minister of Great Britain, and the President of the French Republic. There is an elaborate consultation procedure, which I'm not sure how much of it is in the public domain, but essentially says you have to give particular attention to the views of states where the weapon would be used. That's largely irrelevant now. That comes out of the old days when we had battlefield weapons. Where it would be launched from, because that makes the state a target once again, and who owns the delivery system. That, when you got to pay attention to the NATO allies, particularly if you want to use NATO to deliver the bombs that are still in Europe.
So if NATO could actually have permission to carry one of those.
They could, but it would be the President of the United States' decision. The nuclear use is a presidential decision.
Of our bombs. And they may decide to use, Germany may decide to use a British weapon. Right?
Well, there are no British weapons except ballistic missile submarine weapons, so they wouldn't. The French do have bomb-delivered weapons from both land and sea, but the French are not part of the NATO nuclear structure, and I told you how bad my record is to predict the future. But if you ever see France willing to have somebody else use one of its weapons, please call the devil and ask if you can send them some snow shovels. Sir.
Just combining two thoughts, one that you said, which everything I read seems to indicate is true, and that is that within the time period of your lecture, the United States and Russia could be smoldering cinder.
Yep.
With a point that was made over and over again in a book that I just read by Daniel Ellsberg about the Doomsday Machine, which was that delegation of being able to launch exists far outside of just the president's names. And Russia's made it clear that they also have the same capability. So
Capability.
Capability.
Okay. Keep going.
This decapitation concept. Well, when you combine those two ideas, we think both of them are true, there really, all the discussion about specifics is really irrelevant because of that first idea that really we're not going to stop incoming missiles from either launched by sea or by land.
We would if we could. I don't mean to. I don't think U.S. vulnerability is a good thing. I just think it's an inescapable thing.
No, that's what I'm saying. Not good or bad, just right. So under what? How can we possibly think about this whole subject in other than the very broad terms that the probability of an event occurring, like even the launch of one missile to get things started, that any of this, that we should be thinking and talking about anything else other than how to eliminate nuclear weapons.
Okay.
Well, I mean, anything else seems to
Yeah,
be
that's
just kind of a waste. We're talking about very specifics, but
Yeah, and, well, first of all, there are a couple of things that don't alter the import of your basic question. You said that I want to make it clear, because I have not read Mr. Ellsberg's work, but the time in which he was doing that was not today. There were times in the past when there was some kind of free delegation of authority. The most famous, the most well-known, is President Eisenhower, at a time when we thought the threat was Russian Soviet bombers, had said that if Soviet bombers are approaching American airspace, NORAD was authorized to use nuclear interceptors against them. That was an advanced, it was still a presidential decision, but an advanced presidential decision. First of all, I don't know whether there's anything like that. I don't know, for example, in the years in which we had the Looking Glass aircraft flying with a general officer in the back, what that guy had for authorization. I know what they have told me, which is the only thing they can do is put the bombers in the air under positive control. But it is very clear to me that there is now no pre-delegation. What we have done instead is spend a fair amount of money on continuity of government, so that there is a president or a constitutional successor always available to make that decision. And we've spent a very fair amount of money on making the important part of our forces, the largest part on day-to-day submarine force survival. So if it takes a while to sort that out, retaliation is still possible. We've spent a fair amount of time trying to convince make sure the Russians understand that, so they don't think they can get away with decapitation. And I don't think that is a problem. Everything I know about Russia and Russian culture suggests they're at least as paranoid as we are about unauthorized use. For example, where we have a 2-man rule, they have a 3-man rule on something. And so I do not believe that the idea of so what's sometimes called the Mad Major is a real threat. For a while, there was great concern that the Russian early warning system was so decrepit that you wouldn't have an unauthorized use, you'd have an authorized use. That they would believe, remember I told you, they actually think, or at least some of them, that we want to have a first strike capability. Suppose we're in time of tension and they see something that convinces them that there's a large attack going on. Could they decide, since smaller fraction of their forces are survivable, that they had to respond? That worried us a lot. We did a number of things to try to work on that. Some of them worked. Some of them, like the Joint Data Exchange Center, did not. So it is an inherent risk that we've tried to minimize. As you probably know, if right this minute all our ballistic missiles were launched, none of them would go to Russia. They don't have targets. And the ones that have to have a target have a mid-ocean target. That was a detargeting agreement between the United States and the Russian Federation. I have no idea whether that's the Russians are, I mean, it's an agreement, not a treaty, because it's not verifiable, but I know that it's what we do. So I think on the one hand, I want to damp down a little bit your confusion that there are lots of people who can have a bad day and start World War III. On the other hand, the argument, and by the way, your fundamental argument is the argument of Bill Perry and Sam Nunn and Secretary Shultz and Secretary Kissinger. And those are people who deserve to be taken seriously. I mean, I gave you one of my cheap shot lines in the 80s that there were a lot of people who were anti-nuclear, but none of them mattered. That's not true. Biggest change in the last 15 years. I could fill this room with people that for all of my career, I would have to stand up when they walked into a room who believe exactly what you said. The problem is, we have no idea how to do that. We just have no idea how to do that. I mean, we spend a lot of time on little nuances, but fundamentally, this is a political decision. India is always going to be 4 times bigger than Pakistan, and India is always going to have won the last 4 wars, including one which tore Pakistan apart. Do you really believe that I can come up with a condition which will let Pakistan give up their nuclear weapons? Xi has apparently decided he's going to be president for life. And the one thing that can do that is if Taiwan were to declare independence and he couldn't prevent it. And the only thing that might keep him from preventing it is U.S. intervention. And that's what his nuclear program is focused around. Do you think he's going to give that up? Our own country, we didn't give up nuclear weapons unless we're absolutely sure Russia doesn't have them, given the attitude. I don't get to make that decision, but I get to vote, and I got to vote. And so I think the political conditions, and then I'm a former government official. The United States has no position on whether Israel does or does not have nuclear weapons. But if it did, it is surrounded by people who it doesn't care about anybody else's nuclear weapons. It cares that it's surrounded by numerically larger nuclear. Are they going to give up nuclear weapons in a reliable way? And so the political conditions are hard. The technical, and those political conditions have to endure. The technical conditions are very hard. I mean, it's fine to say, I can tell that I have 400 ICBMs rather than 800. I can do that. I mean, I got a big eye in the sky. I can count those things. But to say there aren't 100 weapons in a cave somewhere, I have no idea how to do that. And then finally, I see all glasses as half full, but the history of the human race suggests that sooner or later, bad people will arise. And so if you do this and somebody decides, hey, if we were the only ones that had them, we could get a great advantage. We don't have any concept of an enforced mechanism other than world federalism, which hasn't been a big thing in the political debate since the early 50s. We can't depend on the UN Security Council because the most likely violators are the permanent members. So I think that the question is, I think it's really hard, but suppose for the sake of argument, and here I'm farther from the mainstream and I don't want this to be attributed to anybody other than me. Suppose we could. Suppose we could eliminate nuclear weapons. You know, I grew up in a world in which we didn't have nuclear weapons. Bruno Triad, French analyst, wrote, it's been attributed to a lot of other people, but he actually wrote it. I've seen the essay. There is a monument to the failure of conventional deterrence in every French village. And I think, I've drunk the Kool-Aid. You look at that chart, I think that there are millions of people who very sincerely are saying we should give up nuclear weapons, who are alive because there wasn't the kind of major interstate war that nuclear weapons have prevented. And so you got, and that unfortunately is not something you can demonstrate. I mean, if you can invent, you can demonstrate that there's a way to verify the abolition of every nuclear weapon. I mean, the laws of physics will probably let you do that. I don't quite know how, but they'll let you do that. But the question about whether or not that will make nuclear war, I mean, large-scale conventional war, over the next 10 decades, more or less likely, that's a belief question, really. I mean, I don't think that the science of international relations has any prospect of being good enough to tell us that. And so, this is me personally, I don't think it's possible. So to some extent, the intellectual energy that goes into this ought to be focused on the real thing. The enemy's not nuclear weapons, the enemy's nuclear use. So let's put some of that intellectual energy into how do we prevent that. I don't think it's possible to abolish. If it is, I think the hardest things are not going to be the things that we were working on during the Obama administration. They're not going to be how do we go from 500 to, they are the broad political things in which we were not. And, you know, we've been trying to solve peace in the Middle East, if I read the Hebrew scriptures correctly, for 5,000 years. We're not there yet. And so I mean, there's a whole lot of peacemaking that can be done. I'm sorry, you hit a push to talk about that, and I appreciate it. But my point is, even if you can do it, and spend more time than you want telling stories of what it's like to be in a kind of, we were there as conquerors, we lived fine. So I think that, yes, of course, you'd like to do that. Yes, of course, guys like Bill Perry. You know, I want to be Bill Perry when I grow up. But I just think on this one, he's wrong. I think some things really are too hard, and this is one of them.
I'm going to close the formal Q&A, and please join me in thanking Ambassador Brooks.
you're now officially licensed to get up and walk out. I am going to sit here and as long as anybody wants to ask me a question.
So here was the question I was going to ask.